we all know the context in which this project takes place, but I'm going to go into a bit more on how the context very much affects this particular type of work, more so than it's not just a background or a context. It's woven through everything that this project does and it tries to accomplish. So I'll start with that, and then I'll start with the genesis of the project itself, and then I'll move on from there. Yeah, so Ian White, actually I owe for this one, he was telling me when we were having a chat that we probably picked like the worst time, the most challenging time in possible for doing this type of work, which he meant by, you know, this peace and reconciliation type of work, because the last few years have been very difficult for it in Northern Ireland. Just very quickly, the meta conflict, which is the conflict about the conflict, continues kind of you know, unabated. The executive collapsed, of course, right when this project was getting rolled out, which doesn't instill confidence or a desire to engage generally when your government has collapsed in the midst of these recriminations. Government House Agreement, which was the last kind of major attempt to do anything regarding the legacy of violence in Northern Ireland. And, you know, the Stormont House Agreement kind of very much set a low bar. And even that was taken off the table. I'm not going to make any blanket political statements. I'm sure you all know where I stand. You had the rise of you had the election of the administration, who promised in his campaign that he would put an end to, you know, vexatious investigations into Northern Ireland's past, which itself was, of course, a violation of even the very basic sort of investigatory and judicial mechanisms of the Stormont House Agreement. So the key point that I made in the report is that we have to look at this project as taking place within the context of a disincentivizing regime or set of circumstances. It disincentivizes victims and survivors in Northern Ireland to engage in specifically in these sorts of reconciliation or peace building projects when they don't feel, generally speaking, I'm not going to say all of them, but generally speaking, when victims and survivors communities don't feel there's any reciprocal kind of engagement from the echelons of power, not just in Northern Ireland, but in the United Kingdom or in the Republic of Ireland either. Okay. So it kind of promotes sort of atmospheres of distrust, I guess I would call it, atmospheres of a lack of faith in continuing to work within a reconciliatory framework. All right. So I don't really have a slide for this, but I'll talk a little bit about the genesis of the project, which Will and I were primarily responsible for crafting. This is a SEUPB project, as you all know, and more importantly, it was designed, and we thought it would make it a process-based project. Which I mean, like we wanted the process of this co-developed methodological engagement where the groups themselves are active and involved in the co-design of everything to be front and center in all of this. So that's not an outcome-based process, it's a project-based process and a process-based process. And of course, the problem is that you still have to craft an application in terms of outcomes, right? And those outcomes are often things that are not only difficult to measure or difficult to achieve, but they're difficult to directly link from slow incremental trust building processes to, you know, general outcome. But it's not a context that many of us are unfamiliar with who work in this or a related sector. So just to say a little bit about myself, I'm what's called ethnographer by inclination and by training. So the way that some people have called ethnography kind of the fine art of hanging out, which just means that, like, that's how I do research. That's how I've always done research, is I hang out with people and try to pick up insights and information from what I'm observing and what they're telling me. So I tried to skew the evidentiary basis of this report and all the work I've done here based on that sort of methodology. It's not the only methodology that you can use, but it is the one that I'm familiar with. Some of the key insights regarding that I laid out for the team and the Glencree staff yesterday was that I think that for people that are not in this sector, and specifically in this sector in Northern Ireland, there can be a widespread assumption, which is fueled by the press and fueled by government and stuff like that, that victims and survivors groups in communities in Northern Ireland are monolithic, or pillarized at least. That Catholic survivors of state violence are this, and Protestant survivors of Republican violence are this, and that's not true. It's not true at all. So we think that if you're going to engage in this sort of practice-based process, that it really is dependent on an intimate understanding of the intergroup dynamics of a particular victims and survivors group, and especially the local contexts in which survivor groups exist, operate, and live. And especially within that, their proximities to power. Like, we work with victims and survivors groups that have, I think it's fair to say, little to no proximity to power. They exist as minority communities in areas where they're not going to be listened to, and they don't have any sort of. And then we exist with, and then we work with victims and survivors groups that also probably have a great deal of influence over, especially certain politicians. So we have to understand, like, what the dynamics, what the power dynamics are of the people that we're working with there. And a lot of victims and survivors groups advocacies is based on particular issues that drive or animate key members. If you're in Enniskillen, or you're in East Tyrone, or you're along the border there, those are different issues that drive groups that are based on those geographical locations than would be that maybe a group that's driven for justice for one particular atrocity in Belfast, right? And we have groups here that run the gamut of all of those. So that's important. We can't treat them all the same, and the report basically lays out that point. The key concepts that we use, like peace and reconciliation, often mean very different things to different groups of people. And so, for example, as I mentioned yesterday, there's a pretty well-established conclusion in the literature that Protestant Unionist loyalists communities in Northern Ireland often don't take kindly to words like reconciliation. They don't see it in the same ways that we do. Rushing says it's often seen as tantamount to surrender, and she's right. It's also tantamount to being seen like they have to give up what they're doing in order for Northern Ireland as a whole to move on. And if they can't do that, then they're the problem, right? Which is not always a great, reaction. Doesn't always provoke a great reaction within them. So Glencree, as a peace and reconciliation organization, already has kind of a strike against them when it comes to working with Protestant Unionist loyalist communities as well. Though I think that was one of the reasons why we really tried to put it in this trust-based, process-based approach. And then the other thing, and again, this always kind of surprises me that more people aren't aware of this is that the Republic of Ireland, especially for PUL survivors, remains a source of threat, mistrust, and frustration. So again, you'll find that for some of the groups we work with, simply crossing the border is something that A, many of them have never done, B, many of them have never considered, and C, is scary. It's plain and simple. It's fearful. So it's fear-provoking. So in that context, I think we come at things maybe with, sometimes we generally come at things with a bit of we come at it a bit as if that's how we don't understand that. Like how it's 20 years on from now, how can you still be feeling this way? Like, and we need to like kind of acknowledge where people come from. And I found that there were genuine benefits to it that should not be dismissed or sneezed at. And they basically, it is this whole thing about it. deficit of trust, not only in other people and other groups, but in projects like these itself. So what this kind of co-designed co-developed methodology does is it, over time, gradually is a very powerful mechanism to rebuild that trust and to actually allow, not to put words in their mouths, I guess, as one person put it. And it's also, you should point out that it's hard to sometimes these groups are very flighty. Sometimes they want to do something one day and want to do something else another day, and you're like, but we did all this work like trying to design something for that, and they're like, no, now we want to do that. And that, I think, is another strength of this project, is that it can actually sort of walk beside people's journeys of discovery, in a sense. But the specific drawbacks, I think, here are also important. First of all, I think that if you're gonna use a design like this, there's two things. Number one is from a project delivery standpoint, you need to be 100% sure that you've done the work beforehand to make sure that each one of the groups is involved and invested. And if not, what you're going to find is that when you go your initial reaching out to the groups itself, you're going to find if they're on a different page from you, or they don't know exactly what this project is, or they haven't been explained to it enough, then that's like a year down the drain, where you actually have to physically rebuild that trust and say, look, no, we're not trying to mold you in travel. This is actually, what do you want to do and how can we help? And if you haven't made that case clear beforehand, or you haven't carefully kind of chosen the groups that you want to work with to make sure that they're kind of good candidates for this type of thing, then that can really impact your project delivery. The other problem I think I see is that and I'll just say that bluntly, for Glencree to try to be the solo partner on this project. And I know that there were reasons. I was there. I know that there were reasons why this was done. But what that did was that put Glencree at the mercy of the groups for project delivery. Where we're at within the project right now, and the first thing to say is that against all odds, and everybody that's working this project deserves an awful lot of credit for this. And you're delivering what you said you had. SEUPB, if they're not satisfied, they should be. Against all odds, you've hit your targets to this point, which I think is something that bears saying. We had, many of you remember, we had the meeting at Ballyscallion in Carlingford, and where there was kind of a tete-a-tete from the team. We all looked at it and said, look, for the first 2 years of this project, we've largely been confined to doing work within the groups, right? Work within the groups of building trust and preparing them to go out and kind of meet other people, or that's kind of a really bad way to put it. But where the actual sort of contact basis of this project that we said we were going to do in the application needs to start coming now, circa beginning of 2019, 18, whatever, I can't remember. Anyway, then the pandemic hit, right? And all of a sudden, face-to-face stuff was thrown for a loop. So what we have to do, and I think that first quarter of 2019, before the 2019, the first quarter of 2020, there was a lot of really great and impressive work being done, actually translating what this project was going to be doing, which was putting the groups in contact with other groups, maybe even starting to talk about former perpetrators, education professionals, all the people that the groups began to sort of start to meet and began to be ready to sort of start to meet, kind of hit the wall of the pandemic. So what we have is kind of a very ambitious and very, I think, laudatory set of ideas for what we can for what you can do moving forward with the remainder of the project, but a very difficult, an even more difficult external context, where not only all the stuff that's going on in Northern Ireland generally is still going on, but we also have this pandemic. So that's the challenge, and it's a really hard challenge of how do we ensure that in the last year of the project, a lot of this really cool stuff that's been proposed happens in the context of a global pandemic. So the project suffered at the outset, there's no denying this, from insufficient scoping and unwarranted confidence in the overlap between Glencree's and the participating group's priorities. But in spite of this, LOV is on track, which I find that I honestly, like, looking at this from the outside, I find this very surprising and very impressive. The co-design methodology can build trust in difficult contexts and promote increased participant confidence and senses of empowerment. However, projects relying on such a methodology must build in incentives, and especially formal partnerships, to avoid being at the mercy of groups. I didn't find any evidence of big major macro level changes in group attitudes as a consequence of this project, but I don't know how I would find that. Like, I don't believe in methodologies that claim that they can prove that.